Hi, Dave Scotland for a Tuts, and welcome to another episode of Nuke in Production. Today we're going to take a look at colour correction and colour grading tools. We're certainly not going to get a chance to look at every colour correction or grading tool in Nuke, but we are certainly going to get a chance to have a look in detail at some of the main players. So if I show you the colour toolbar, you can see that there are a lot of choices there, and some of the terminology you may recognize if you're familiar with After Effects, but they aren't always exactly what they seem if you are, as I say, familiar with other applications. So let's have a look at the ones that I use the most. I use a grade node, a color correct, a saturation node, a color lookup, and a hue correct. So let's have a look at what these nodes do. Let's have a look at the grade node first. I'm going to double click on it and bring up its properties on the right. The grade node, realistically, if you were coming from an After Effects background, you would probably liken the grade node as far as its functionality, even though the interface looks a lot different. The functionality is very similar to levels in After Effects, and there's not much here that I couldn't do with levels in After Effects. So at the top you'll see that it's got channel selection where I can apply this grade to the RGB or the RGBA, or even just work on the alpha itself or any other layer that I may have available to me in the comp. And the way I use a grade node is from the top to the bottom, and I'll show you what I mean. The first thing I like to do is set my black and white points. So I'm just going to take this image here, give myself a little bit of real estate. I'm going to use my gamma and exposure settings at the top of my viewer, and I'm going to gamma all the way up, and I'm even going to bring my exposure up. And what I'm trying to do is establish what is the darkest tone in the entire image, and the more I go up, you'll find that I can just see this little tiny section up in here is just visible. Everything else has been washed out or clipped to white, but I still see this dark section here. So if I click on the black swatch here for the black point, just to activate the eyedropper, and then I use the control key. Now notice what can happen too sometimes. As I select it, I'm actually getting some unwanted feedback in the viewport. I find the best thing to do is to actually switch the node off by using the D hotkey, and now I can hold down control and click on a pixel, or I can hold down control and shift and drag on a couple of pixels just to get an average of that little section there. So what I've done is I've actually set a value for the black point. Now I need to do the same for the white point. So what I'm going to do is bring it down the other direction and try to find what part of the image is the brightest part of the image. So I'm going to really gamma that down in my viewer, and if I pull it down, you can start to see that it's on the jumper, and if I get it just right, I can leave it so that it's just exposing the brightest area on that jumper. So I can click on the white point swatch now and do the same thing, hold down control and shift to just drag on a couple of those, and you'll see a value populated in the white point here now. So now I can hit the red figures to return my gamma and exposure back, and then switch on the node. And I hit D. So now I'm dealing with an absolute true value. Now there isn't a lot of difference in this image because this was actually shot with a red, and I actually exposed or set up the exposure goalposts extremely carefully for this particular image. But you'll find that you may get a really good result on your imagery just from resetting your black and white points with the grade node. So I mentioned before I moved from the top to the bottom, so the next thing I'm going to do is go into lift and gain. Now lift and gain, you can hold your mouse over the lift and gain to see what exactly they do, but put simply, lift just is basically the setting that black is turned into. So whatever you do with this, notice the black on this strap here. If I start to go down in value, it's going to get darker. So this makes black darker. Lift makes black darker or lighter if you travel in the positive, and gain makes white darker or lighter. So I can lift up a little bit if I wanted to overexpose the image. I could bring it down to underexpose the image. And what I'm going to do is just pop it above 1. And then I'll come down to multiply. Now multiply is the constant to multiply the result by. So this is global. No matter what I set up here, multiply is actually multiplying those values uniformly. So the dark and lights, the whites and black points are actually multiplying uniformly together. And also I can mute them going down in the other direction as well. So I might just pop that just a little bit into the negative, just to take away a little bit of that overexposure. So the offset is like lift. It's similar to lift, except it will actually lift the black and white points. So you can bring up the black and white points. You'll see that the black is getting brighter, but so is the white. And you can bring down, the black is getting darker, but so is the white. So I'm going to just bring that down slightly. And the gamma is your final correction. Once you've set everything above correctly, you'll find that the gamma, you get a lot of control out of the gamma. Now, if you don't set everything above correctly, working from the top to the bottom, gamma really doesn't give you what you want. You'll find most of these settings don't really give you what you want, and you will instead spend an incredible amount of time in the grade node moving back and forth between settings. Just try it. Try to work from the top down, and you will find that your manipulations or tweaks are going to be a lot better. So the next one I wanted to have a look at is the color correct. Now color correct is the hotkey C. Just close this down and double click to bring up the settings. Color correct allows you to control various settings based within the shadow, midtone and highlight ranges of an image. And it also has a master section, which is a global all over section as well. So I like to use the color correct very similar to the grade node in that I like to work from the top down, and I like to get a global feel for the saturation level, the contrast level, the gamma, the gain, and then go in and start to tweak the shadows, midtones and highlights. So let's have a look at this image here. Before I jump in and show you some of these settings, I'm going to show you the second tab here, which is ranges. And if we look at it, if I highlight just the shadow, you can see that the shadow has this fall off. It drops right down, and the midtone has this fall off that goes right up to the top and then starts to fall over. The way this actually works is the shadow, the midtone and the highlights are 3 distinctly different graphs, and I can affect the range of the shadow, and you'll see that the midtone is reactive, where whatever I do with the shadow, the bottom end of the midtone will actually line up and react appropriately. And I've also got the highlight section as well, where I can grab the highlight curve, which is over here. I can make the highlights a lot tighter and have much more of a midtone. But it also has this nice test feature, and if I click on that, I can actually bring up the shadow detail and push the shadow detail more and more into the midtone. I can also squash the shadow detail down and maybe bring the highlight detail back into the midtone as well. And obviously the midtone is actually reactive to that. You'll see that there's no handles on the midtone graph at all. And then when you're happy with this, you can come out of the test mode back to your image. Now nothing has changed because we haven't done anything to it. We'll test this scenario out. I'm just going to go into the gain in the shadows, and I'm going to make them bright red. So there's our bright red shadows. Now I'm going to leave those as is and then go back into my ranges and show you what happens when we adjust those shadows now. So as I pull the shadows into the midtones more, we're increasing the amount of shadow in the image, and you'll see that the red is creeping back into the midtone areas. And so that's basically how color correction works as far as breaking things into shadow, midtone and highlight. So I'm just going to reset everything in the node, and I'm going to tweak this a little bit. What I want to do is start from the top down. In my master section, I'm going to bring a little bit more saturation into the image. Not too much, about that much should be okay. And maybe contrast it up slightly. And the way contrast works in Nuke is it's basically the mathematical separation of the red, green and blue values. So the more contrast you have, the more separate the numbers become mathematically. That's fairly standard for the way contrast is read in an RGB environment. So I'm going to come down to the shadows now, and in the gain section I'm going to click on the color wheel and I'm going to cool off the shadows a little bit. So I like to use the TMI controls for my color corrections or for my color wheels, and that allows me to very easily just jump into a cool palette and then bring in a little bit more contrast into that cool palette. So a little bit more, something like that should do. And that's in the gain for the shadows. And I'm going to warm up the highlights. So I'm going to go into the gain for the highlights, jump into the color wheel. I'm just going to warm those up and just bring them into this color. You can see that the lights start to go a little bit yellow. Just bring it back a little bit. Something like that. I'm just brightening them up a little bit as well. That's looking pretty good. Bit of color. And now I'm just going to adjust a little bit of saturation. Just bring a little bit of saturation into the shadows so that the shadows are a bit bluer. And the highlights I'm going to make a little bit warmer as well. And then just a little bit of contrast in both. And then I might just go into my ranges now. And I'm going to bring my shadow range up slightly, just to darken things down a little bit, or bring a little bit more of that blue in. But I'm going to bring my highlight up a little bit so that it's not in the image too much. Something like that should be okay. So my midtone's really quite wide in this treatment. And I might just bring the overall gain of the midtones up slightly. That's probably going to do it. Now I'm going to come back to my master control and then adjust the overall gain and maybe gamma, something like that. And you can see it's very hot, but that was what I was going for because I wanted to just adjust my saturation after the fact, my contrast. Something like that, and then just gamma down to get what I wanted. So I'm happy with the midtones and the shadows, but the highlights are really too hot. So I'm going to desaturate those, bring them down, maybe take a bit of the contrast. The contrast isn't too bad. I might just gamma those up a little bit and adjust the offset, and then maybe just bring in the range slightly on the highlights as well. I think that's working okay. That way I'm getting a little bit of a warm center to the light, and then it's blowing out on the edges. And that is giving me quite a nice feel. Oh, just want to make sure that that offset is okay. So I'm going to switch that on and off. And you can see this is very architectural, and it's actually a little bit more accurate, whereas this is a little bit more filmic, and it plays on the complementary warm and cool teal versus yellowy orange colors. This is definitely, if I hide and unhide, one is definitely a lot more filmic and the other is a little bit more architectural. So color correction is a fantastic tool, and I do use that quite a lot. So the next one is quite simple. It's just a saturation node. If I double click on it, and it's a fantastic node to really just jump in there quickly and desaturate an image. So it's a great way to drop it down to a black and white. So it's a little bit similar to a tint in After Effects, but it's a little bit more intelligent by the way it uses the mathematical calculation of the black and whites and how they're represented in the image. Now at the moment I'm using the Rec 709, which is an international standard. It's actually associated with HD TV, but there's a couple of others, and the two at the bottom are the ones I'll bring your attention to. The average is basically looking at all of the values, the color values in the image. So for every pixel, the red, green and blue value is averaged, and then it's the average amount that the mathematics is using the average amount of that pixel to give it its final desaturated value. whereas the maximum looks at the maximum value for each pixel. When you take each red, green and blue value in the image, you'd look at the maximum value, and it's the value that's used in the mathematics to give you your desaturated image. So it's also the value used when you do an oversaturated image. So you can see the difference between maximum there and average. Average is actually just a bright version of our original image, whereas maximum is really doesn't bear any resemblance to our original image and has no bearing on reality. And then we've got our Rec 709, which is really quite close to our original image, albeit a lot hotter or saturated version, which is what we would expect. So Rec 709 is going to give you what you want most of the time, but be aware that there are other methods here, and average is also not too bad for doing this type of work. That's the saturation node. Let's have a look at our color lookup. Now, color lookup is found in another section of Nuke, and if I just close these up and hit S anywhere in a blank area of my node graph, we can see our project settings. Now, we've discussed these before, but what we didn't go into in too much detail is the LUT or the LUT or the lookup table tab in our project settings. Now, what you're looking at here are all of the different standards for a lookup table as far as color. And a lot of these are very commonly used. The ones that are used the most is the linear, sRGB, and then you start to get into Rec 709, Cineon, some of the gammas there, Panalog, and then you have red space down the bottom. There's an Alexa, and a lot of these are very specific to certain hardware, like the Alexa camera series and red for red cameras. And a lot of renders out of CG renders like 3D Studio Max and Maya will often come out within a 2.2 gamma color space. So what you're looking at here is, for the project, the color space that's actually set for the project. If we were to look at the lookup node, you can see that it's quite similar. At the moment, the color for this image is set to linear. You can see by the master, it's a straight line. But if we click on these points, we can give it maybe a contrasting S curve, like this. Bring it down a little more. And you can see in the image over here, if I hide and unhide that what we've done is basically provided a lot more contrast, and as you would expect. Now, for After Effects users, the curves effect is probably the most similar to the color lookup node. It gives you your master, which is equivalent to your RG and B curve. And if I just reset this, and it also gives you red, green, blue, and an alpha. So if I wanted to make my image a little bluer in the shadows, I could come into my blue and I hold down Alt and Control and click somewhere on the line to create a point. And so I could bring my blue colors down. So I could increase my blue color in the shadow areas, and then Alt Control to click on another point just to bring the rest back where they were. And that allows me to put fine tuning on the bottom part of the node. And then I could go back to my master, maybe Alt Control and click on the master, maybe bring the high end, bring a bit of contrast to the top end, and then add an extra point and just bring this back to where it was. And that's just going to give me a little bit of control up the top. If I hide and unhide, you can see we're getting what we need there. And then I could maybe take the red and just generally bring the red down a little bit in the image, and that'll push it into a sort of a greeny blue type palette. I can also affect the alpha. In this instance, I don't have any alpha in the image, but if I had, say, a 50% alpha channel in the image, I could use the alpha curve to increase the alpha a little bit, and I have used this quite a bit to actually bring a little bit of semi-transparent definition back out in an alpha channel. So, as I said before, if you've ever used a curves modifier in After Effects or Photoshop, then certainly you can relate to how this works. One good feature that I'll press on here, if I do a marquee selection around both those points, I get a box like this, and I can actually move this box around in the graph, and I can also manipulate it and squash it up, stretch it out, smooth it. It's certainly a fantastic way to do some global movement of these points. So the last one I wanted to have a look at is a hue correct. Now, I use a hue correct quite a lot when it comes to getting rid of spill lighting from green screen shots, and there are some features in some of the green screen technologies or green screen nodes, and we're going to get to that in a future episode. And some of those features actually remove the spill and have spill suppression built in. But you can't really beat a little bit of hue correct when it comes to this type of work. It allows you to really hone in on a specific hue. So let me show you what that means. This is your hue correct node, and you'll see that I have saturation, which is the level of saturation for all of the colors in the spectrum. I've got luminosity. I've also got red, green, and blue, which is the isolated colors shown in a graph here. And I've got red suppression, green suppression, blue suppression, and then I've got my saturation threshold. So I'm not going to go through every single option in this tool, but what I will show you is how to basically affect certain hues in an image. So I'm going to go with the green suppression, and what I can actually do is hold down my Control Shift and just drag a little section of the teapot, and it will show me in the graph. This yellow bar is normally reactive. So if I deselect over here, you'll see that where I point in my viewport, the yellow bar is reactive in the image. Over here it's blue, this is red, this is green. But if I hold down Control and Shift, I can draw a little window or select a couple of pixels, and it will stay there for me. And what that allows me to do is to hold down Control Alt and click on a new point in the window. And now I can drag that point down. And you'll see that what I'm doing is I'm actually suppressing that hue. And it's almost like I'm removing that hue from my color spectrum. So I can pull it down, then I can maybe pull the handles out. You can hold down Control to pull these handles out, like so. So let me undo that. Pull that back to where it was. Another section in this tool allows me to actually go into the green, and I'm still stuck on that section there, so I can Control Alt and grab a new one, and I can actually bring the value of that green up and maybe widen this a little bit, bring my handles out a bit, and I can actually affect that particular hue as far as its saturation. I could also go into the saturation tab and then bring that saturation up. You can see how hot that gets, and or I can pull it in the other direction, which you'll see actually diffuses that saturation quite a lot. So the hue correct is a fantastic tool, and I do use it quite a lot. As I said before, these are only a couple. They only represent a very small amount of power that you have in the color correction list, but I definitely suggest that you start out with these and then work from there into the other tools and become familiar with all of the tools available in the color correction and grading palette. Okay, so what I wanted to do was a very quick and simple comp and show you some of these tools in action. So what I've got is a background image here, and then I've got a render to suit that background image, just done in 3D Studio Max with a little bit of V-Ray lighting. What I'm actually doing with this background image is it is an EXR, but I'm not going to be using the multi-passes. I'm just going to treat it as one, just to show some of the power of the color correction tools that I've shown you. Then, of course, I've got a little bit of a dust element that I'm going to be using just to help bring the car and the background together a little bit better. So we'll put these to the side for now, or this one over to the side for now. And I'm going to take my car and merge it over my image. So the background is the dominant pipe, so it's going to be my B pipe. So I select it first, I hold down Control, or hold down Shift, sorry, and select my car, and hit the hotkey M for merge, and they'll be positioned properly. Now, what you'll get is this semi-transparent process, and the reason for this is that the image itself was actually rendered without pre-multiplication. So what I need to do to get rid of this is to implement a pre-multiplication process and allow the alpha channel to multiply the red, green and blue and alpha by the alpha channel. So that's generally what pre-multiplication is. And if I just use my tab creation key and type in pre, you'll see pre-mult there. And by clicking on it, I get a true alpha channel the way it should be. Now, there is a bit of an issue, and I'm going to show you what that is. If I come in here, notice that there's a little row of pixels around my entire car. We're going to fix that problem up in a little while, but the thing to remember when you are doing any color correction on an asset that has an alpha channel is this pre-multiplication. It's very important to do a pre-mult, then do your color correction, and then I'm going to show you what I mean by that. Put in a grade, and then you put another pre-mult after. There it is, and you'll see that the outline that I was talking about before has disappeared. That halo, that glow around the edge has actually disappeared. Also, it's important that you read your footage in correctly, and at the moment my color space is sRGB. The default came in as linear, and that was incorrect. Don't just assume that Nuke reads your color space correctly on your read nodes. Color correction starts with having your read node in the correct color space. The first thing I'm going to do is try to get my background ready, because if I'm going to be color correcting this car, I want to make sure that the background is set first. So I'm going to create a saturation node, and I want to just desaturate the image slightly. It's a little bit too bright, a little bit too picturesque. So I'm going to desatch it down into something that's a little bit more believable. I'm not going to wipe too much saturation out of it, but just enough to make it feel a little bit more natural. And now you'll see that the car stands out a little bit because it's out of a 3D render, and we need to do the same on the other side. So what I'm going to do with the car, before I start grading it, I'm going to put a desaturation on it as well. So just a saturation node, double click on it and bring some saturation out of the car. Not too much, it's probably enough. Yeah, I think that's going to work okay. And I'm also going to have a look at a grade node here, where, let's have a look at it. You can see that there's some darks here that are a little bit too dark for our image. And what we can do with this is bring the gamma up in my viewer, and you can see the difference here. And what I want to do is bring my dark point more in line with something over here, or maybe something over here. Now granted, it's a little greener, but reset this back. Now I can actually lift my dark point from a better place. That's probably it. I'm going to leave it like that for now, because there's another tool that I use called a toe node, and I'm going to bring that in shortly. Now the white point, I'm okay with the white point. The brightest white points are the highlights anyway. They're okay in the image. I'm just going to gain it around a little bit and see what I can get. Now, I'm not happy with the reflections. The reflections are way too bright in the image. So this is what I'm going to do. Notice if I isolate just the car and come up into my RGBA section and have a look at my layers, I do actually have a reflection layer. And you can see it's actually very bright. It's really dominant in the image. So what I'm going to do is isolate that reflection layer. I'm going to put a dot node out here, plug it into that. And down here I'm going to put a shuffle node, and I'm going to plug that into my dot node, and I'm just going to bring in a grade node. Whoop. There's my grade node there. I'm going to plug that in, and I might even double click and type in here reflection, just so that I know that that's what that grade node is. Just pull these down and out of the road a little bit. And in the shuffle node, I'm going to turn this to reflection, and I'm going to plug it in. If I have a look here, you'll see that that's what's in the shuffle node here. I'm in RGB space, and I'm going to plug that reflection into the grade node as a mask. Okay, now if I look at this in alpha, you'll see that it's exactly what I'm looking for. The white is visible, the black is invisible, and what I can do now is grade. If we come back to our merge, click on that grade node, and if I was to gain, I'm gaining only the reflections. Everything else in the car stays exactly as it was before, but the reflections are now controllable or are being isolated by shuffling that reflection node down and in as a mask. So what I'm going to do is just gain these reflections down a little bit, just sort of mute them slightly, and maybe mult them down slightly as well, not too much. Try to look for the reflection in the door shouldn't be as bright as the reflection on the ground, and it was before. It was actually a little bit brighter, so just mult it down slightly. So let's switch that on and off, and you can see that it's muting those reflections quite a bit, and I'm fairly happy with that. So as I mentioned before, what I like to do is use another color correction tool that we didn't cover in the previous section, called Toe. It's very photographic in the way it's actually used, and cinematographers do speak in terms of toe, and basically it's like globally bringing up the black point in the image. So what I'm going to do is just highlight the grade node there and tab, and then start typing toe. There it is there, and very simple. It's operating on the RGB, and if you lift the toe, you'll see that you're globally bringing up the black point. And at this point, it's important to just make sure that we're not overdoing it. I'm pretty happy with that. In fact, I'm going back to my previous grade. I'm just going to bring that lift down a little bit. It's a little bit too high. Okay, so what I want to do also is have a look at these black tires. They're really, I've affected the toe. If I double click on that and bring that up, it does bring the black out of those tires slightly, and that's working a little bit better. But it would be nice to have a look at the shadow areas of this independently. So for that, I'm going to use a color correct, and just going to have a look at my ranges. Going to switch those on and just see what we have to work with here. It looks like my shadows are about, that's not too bad. I'm not going to really affect my highlights, but that's probably going to give us what I want. Now if I start to gamma around those shadows, you can see that they're just the shadow areas, so I can bring a bit of extra color Something like that's probably going to do me. There's really not that much in it, or just a little bit of minus on the gamma. And bring the saturation out a little bit in those shadows as well. And pull a bit of that contrast out as well. So that's certainly starting to feel a little bit better. So the next thing I'd like to do to bring a bit of believability to this, if you look at the image around it, it has a level of blur. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this below the pre-mult and just hit a blur. There's really no need for a Z blur in this. I could put a Z blur in. There is certainly a Z depth layer in the render, but because of the level of focus, if you have a look along the road here, everything is quite focused out to about 40 or 50 feet away, and we would not see too much of a fall off of blur on the car. So I'm just going to put a normal blur on it just to bring an element of believability to the pixel blurred values relative to the pixels around it in the background. And that's probably working okay. About a 1.5 is too much. I think around about 1. So about a 1 pixel blur, or 1 in the size. And if I switch that on and off, you'll see that there's just a bit of sharpness taken away or taken out of it. So the next thing I'd like to do is do a little bit of a global color correct. So this is going to be in the B pipe after the merge. And if I just tab, pull up my color correct, or I can use the hotkey C. So just underneath it, what I'm going to do is just have a look at it as a whole image, and maybe bring the saturation down a little bit more, contrast slightly down as well. I could probably gain it up just a little bit, but if I look at my ranges and bring the shadows up slightly, maybe bring the highlights up a little bit as well, untick that text. What I want to do is the high end, the saturation, the high end, sorry, I'm going to warm up the top end. So I'm bring up, gain up the high end with some warmth, and then the saturation I'm going to gain down with some cool into the greens, a little bit warmer. And then I'm going to desaturate a little bit on that bottom end and maybe gamma it, gamma it down just a little. And on the top end, maybe gamma up a little bit just to give it a little warmth. And then just pull my global saturation down slightly. Something like that looks okay. I'm happy with that. It definitely feels quite filmic. So the next thing I'm going to do is put a vignette in the piece, and there's a node that we can use. It's called a radial. I'll click on a radial, and that's pretty much what a radial is. It's very similar to a solid in After Effects if you put a radial mask on it. What I'm going to do is merge it over the top. So I'm going to put a merge node after my color correct, and I'm going to put the radial over the top. And I'm going to set the merge to a multiply, and that gives me dark around the edge. And then I'm just going to stretch this out to beyond the outside of my piece, and that's looking pretty good. And I might even lean it over to where the car is a little bit more. And then all I do now is bring up my merge and wind down the mix on the merge. Not too much. That's going to do it. So I'll close these out. And you can always go back and fine tune the radial shape. And the next thing I want to do in my pipe is do a crop. I just want to crop this down a little bit. I just want to make it feel a little bit more widescreen. And I want to click on a reformat because I want to crop this to that format now. Now I want to put in some dust elements, and I've got my dust over here. So what I'm going to do with that is I might just bring this up, so I can bring in my dust. So I'm going to merge the dust in. So there it is over the top of everything. I'll come through to frame 50. We'll just have a look at what the dust looks like, and that's not too bad. It's huge, so I'm just going to put a transform node on it, and that'll allow me to scale it down, bring it into position. Go back to here. So I just want this dust to be bellowing out sort of from the back of the car. And I'm going to set the merge node for that to a plus. And then I'm just going to put a grade after the transform and just lift up the gain, just get it a bit brighter. And then I'm just going to put a simple roto and start laying in a roto shape. This one I think, just pull it out, something like this should do us. Pretty loose. I'm going to grab all those points, hit Z to make them smooth. And I'm going to make this pre-multiplied by the RGBA and start playing with the feather. Like that. And if I hit O, or I can right click and get rid of my overlay, I can see the dust a little clearer. And the idea here is to make sure that, and if I just Control Shift X to break the merge out, what I want to do is make sure that the merge goes in before the car. And now you'll see that the dust is behind the car. I'll just pull that down here. So make sure that the feather is working correctly. Got a nice fall off on the feather, and then definitely fine tune to get what you need. I think this is working pretty well. I could probably pull a little bit more dust back here. It's supposed to be really quite faint. Mind you, I'm doing this quite quickly, but I think you can get an idea of what we're working at there. And then I just use the grade node and just malt it up a little bit. That's working pretty well. Now you'll notice it's a little bit yellow, so what I'm going to do is put a saturation node on there as well, and just try to desaturate that yellow out of it a little bit. Try to match this road color. That's working pretty well. Looks alright. And I'm also going to put some more dust down here coming out from the wheels from the side a little bit as well. Now what we can actually do, I'm going to pull this dust out to the side. Just going to pull this underneath. And this dust is going to be in front of the car, so it has to come after. So I'm going to put a merge here and pull this up to here. Looks like we've got one too many pipes there. That's better. And same again, I need a transform. So make sure that the transform node is plugged in correctly there. Double click on that to bring up its transform. This one can be quite small. So I'm going to wind it down probably about, let's make it something like this. Whoa. Just pull it down into position. Make the merge node a plus, so double click on that. This one's a plus. And we could copy the grade node and the saturation from the previous one. So I'm just copying those two, Control C, and then click on a space, Control V, and plug them in here before the transform. I think we can get this a little tighter, something like that. Now, if I have a look at this, I don't really like this particular frame. We could change the frame at which we're looking at this detail, and I think that there is a little bit brighter. So when we look at our transform now, we've got a lot more detail in that dust. So if we bring back to here, and so I think that transform is working okay. Just bring it across. Probably about there should be fine. We can always resize it in a minute. And I'm going to put a roto on this, but this time I'm going to use it as a mask. So if I bring up a new roto and plug it into my mask, I can start drawing my roto shape out. We can always amend this. Put a little bit of a feather on it. In fact, let's not put a feather on it for now. Instead, I'll hit O to get rid of it. And what I'm going to do is put a blur in between that and the merge. And just bring up that blur on the edge. Now, the beauty of this is it will merge, it will blur the actual mask, but it won't blur the detail coming from the dust. So now what we can do is, I might just change that merge from a plus to a screen, and then I can fine tune the roto a little bit. Make all of these smooth. Just hit Z. Just bring that out a little bit. Bring this guy back. We can definitely use the fall off up here. Probably went a little bit big on that one, given that the edge of the image is there. So we can probably bring this guy in a little bit. That's probably enough. And maybe bring a little bit of fall off out here as well. So let's have a look at that. Now we can just go into the merge and bring down the mix a little bit and just tune it in to where we want it. And that's certainly helping the process. So the last thing I wanted to add in is a little bit of a light wrap, and there's a fantastic node for that, and it's called light wrap. So I'm just going to stretch these guys out of the road a little bit so we can see what we're doing. So use my tab. This one's, just type in light and you'll see light wrap there. And the way light wrap works is you put your background into the B pipe and you put your foreground into the A pipe. And if I have a look at the product of light wrap, you'll see nothing happens. But if I double click on the light wrap node, the reason nothing happens is at the moment the intensity, or by default the intensity, is set to 0. So light wrap's not actually doing anything. If I go generate wrap only and then bring up the intensity, you'll see that I'm starting to get light wrap detail around the edge. I can disable luminance based wrapping. I can tweak the diffuse, bring that down, bring the amount down. And what we want to do with this light wrap is to drop it on top below the car but above the dust that's in front of the car. So that's in here. We'll just pull that up a little bit. We'll pull the light wrap down into here, and we need a merge node. Let's drop that in there and drop our light wrap in. Let's go back to our crop at the bottom and let's have a look at this light wrap. The light wrap we're going to put in as a screen, and if we just have a look at it, we can bring the intensity up and you can see that it's there. But what we want to do is just subtly, what it's doing is just taking a hint of the detail off the edges of the car. It's introducing a little bit of light detail from what's happening behind the car. So we just want to balance this nicely. Just bring it in somewhere around about 3.54, and then we just dial in the diffuse, and that's looking pretty good. Now the problem with this light wrap is, well, it's not so much a problem with light wrap, it's a problem with the render that I used. Let me just tidy this up. I'm holding control just to bring this up here. The render that I did, I actually included the shadows in the alpha channel. So if I bring up here and hit A, you can see that the shadows are there. Now that really does affect the light wrap, given that the light wrap uses the alpha channel. So what I'm actually going to do is come down here to this merge node, come into here, and I'm going to put a roto, very simple roto here. I'm going to just switch my overlay back on, and I might just go for a very simple rectangle. I'm going to draw up the top, probably about there. That's going to do me, and then I'm just going to feather that a little bit. So if I was to have a look at that roto, the alpha channel, I'm just going to feather it a little, something like that. Maybe even feather it in slightly, and that'll do it. Then I'm going to plug that into the mask of this. Put the A back to the roto here, to the light wrap, and what we should be left with, if I come down into here, if I was to grab my light wrap and crank the intensity, you'll see that it only happens at the top of the car, not down here on the ground, and therefore the shadow is not affected by the light wrap, which is certainly going to work the way we want it to. So now I'm just going to bring my light wrap down, once again just dial it in to where I want it, Somewhere around about 4.5 should do us. Now if I hide that and unhide it, you'll see it just gives me a little bit of wraparound lighting that's coming around the car, and it does make a big difference. Now you do have to be very careful with how much you use, because you can tend to blur the edges. You're not actually blurring them, but it will give the impression that the edges are blurred in the image. So there's our before and after. I've just basically copied the crop node from the bottom just so that the sizes match, and I've got the car coming through a pre-molt so that the alpha is correct and over our background, and that's what we're seeing here. So this is our before and this is our after. So you can see that the colors feel a lot more filmic, a lot more muted down, not deliberate. Even the base background image doesn't quite feel right. I think it's feels a little bit processed, but you can certainly agree that that vehicle does sit in that plate quite well. The blacks feel right, and it basically sits in its environment quite well. So we've covered quite a lot. It's in no way an exhaustive look, but it certainly covers some of the more commonly used tools, and certainly the ones that I use the most. And I hope it's enough for you to get started exploring the world of color correction and color grading. Definitely expose yourself to as many of these tools as possible, because the more you know about the colors and the color process in any compositing package, the better you are at being a compositor within that environment. So that's it for me. Until next time, bye for now.